So now we're going to talk about the most serious form of sentencing punishment that we have in the United States is the death penalty, which is still an option for sentencing in 30 states, as well as the federal government and the military. This first slide is a map of countries around the world that have the death penalty and those that do not. This is a legal history of cases related to the death penalty. I would like you to look up each of these cases, read some facts about it. I would recommend oea.org. You can look at the Wikipedia sites for these. They're pretty informed. But just follow these cases, look them up, and sort of see how the law has progressed in relation to these death penalty Supreme Court cases. But it is important to note one thing that might not be readily available. When a moratorium was placed on the death penalty following the Furman versus Georgia decision, there were still some individuals left on death row in the United States. Those that were sentenced by the federal system and those that were sentenced by the military system. So it didn't remove everyone from death row in 1972, but it did remove the vast majority. And we'll see that in some slides going forward. As I said, capital punishment is a sentencing option in 30 states and with the federal government and the military. There are differential levels with which states actually execute individuals. So though a majority of states have the death penalty as an option, there aren't that many executions in a lot of those states. They're fairly heavily clustered within a few states that execute a lot of individuals, and a lot of states that execute very few. Some, like California, still have the death penalty on the books, but they haven't executed anyone in almost 20 years. This is a look at the population of individuals on death row. As I said, there are a few at the top: Florida, Texas, Alabama. Here in Georgia, we execute a fair number of individuals that execute fairly frequently. The state with the highest population is California because they don't execute individuals. They will sentence individuals to die, but they will not actually carry out the sentence, or they haven't in a number of years. This next slide is looking at a graph of the death row population by year. As you see, it dropped sharply in 1972, almost bottoming out, except for the federal and military individuals, and then ticks back up throughout the 80s and the 90s, and then levels off after a brief decline in the early 2000s. We see on the next slide similar representation in terms of the number of executions carried out each year. It rises with the population, sort of peaks in the late 90s, and then goes down and sort of levels back out again. So there's sort of again, equilibrium that's been reached in terms of the people that are coming on death row and coming off of death row. The population size has stayed relatively stable over the last 20, really 15 years. As we see more, about the same number of people coming on death row as coming off. The other way that people leave death row is through exonerations or commutations. There have been, as you see, over 100 exonerations since 1973. That number has been going down recently. Part of the reason there was such a high number of exonerations in the 1990s, 2000s, is because of the substandard levels with which trials were conducted in the time before that. Evidence that shouldn't have been allowed, evidence that was excluded, evidence that wasn't able to be tested. So the number of exonerations per year has been going down as we have seen an increase in the standards of that trials are held to. So as that increased through the 90s, through the 2000s, through the last decade, there have been less instances where trials have been found to have reversible problems. The next slide shows again that sort of cluster of executions where the crimes have taken place. As you see, there's a lot that have taken place in Texas, around major cities. Usually, people are more likely to face the death penalty in rural areas, but there are some exceptions in places where they're more frequently using the death penalty, and you see that around Houston, Dallas, popular areas in Texas, also in Oklahoma, Missouri, and then Arizona, around major cities there. So there are some things that go against the pattern when we look at where executions take place in terms of in rural areas versus in more urban areas. Okay, the last slide we're going to look at is basically the crux of why executions were halted in 1972, and hopefully you took some time to review the Furman cases and the Gregg cases as listed earlier in the slide. First, the Furman case said that the death penalty was handed down with a racial bias, in that black defendants, especially those who killed white victims, were much more likely to receive the death penalty than white defendants that killed black victims or white victims, either way. By introducing the sentencing phase in the Gregg case, the Supreme Court said that the state of Georgia had done enough to reduce this bias, but these numbers clearly show that has not happened. As far as the race of the defendant, black Americans are much more highly represented in the defendants in terms of the race of the defendants in these cases. Seen almost a third of defendants in these death penalty cases being black, versus making up about 12% of the overall population. So it's almost a 3 times representation there. Additionally, when you look at the race specifically of the offender and the victim, it's very apparent that black defendants that kill a white victim are much more likely to face the death penalty than any other combination of racial group, especially when you look at the opposite, a white defendant with a black victim, there's very little likelihood of facing the death penalty. Further, when we look at the way that this system plays out, the sort of courtroom work group effect, 98% of the prosecutors that handle death penalty cases are white. It's not necessarily saying that they are biased, but they are excluding some of the cultural, social backgrounds that might be relevant towards deciding whether or not to bring the death penalty in a particular case or not. So we're losing some of that review of these cases from alternate perspectives that we might see if there was more minority or at least non-white representation in prosecutors' offices related to death penalty cases. Okay, so make sure to look up those Supreme Court cases that were listed earlier in the PowerPoints. Read the chapter in the text and watch the video that is linked about the death penalty in the to-do list.